Could you recognize the beginnings of a criminal mind, even if it was drawing? He was just a child, 10 years old, quiet, always in a corner of the room, surrounded by sheets of paper and colored pencils. While other children were drawing houses, trees, and happy families, he filled the pages with scenes that looked like they were straight out of a nightmare. A body without eyes, a cage with a child huddled inside, screams drawn in crooked lines. Each scribble was a silent echo of a neglected childhood and a broken mind. This is a story that goes beyond the boundaries of deviant behavior. It's a real-life case study that challenges everything you think you know about forensic psychology, criminal profiling, and the early signs of childhood personality disorders. After all, what makes a seemingly harmless child predict in drawings the horrors he would later commit? Criminal psychology teaches us that the first signs of a failing psyche are rarely explosive. They whisper, they show up in overlooked details, like a habit of dissecting small animals, a lack of empathy in everyday situations, or drawings. Many of these signs are dismissed as simple childhood phases, but experts in criminal behavior know that there is a dark, recurring pattern behind these manifestations. This boy's drawings were not art. They were anticipated confessions, scenes that reflected his distorted perception of reality. While most people around him saw only creativity, those who understand the workings of a child's psychopathic mind know that this was a camouflaged cry for help. Forensic psychology defines this type of behavior as a symbolic expression of unspoken trauma. He didn't speak, but he drew exactly what he felt, and later, what he would do. This is where society often fails. Parents, teachers, peers, they all had access to the evidence. They all saw it, but no one noticed. Or worse, they noticed it and ignored it. Childhood is the birthplace of most serial killers, and it is also the stage for the greatest missed signs in criminal history. A child's mind is moldable. When exposed to environments of neglect, psychological abuse, or domestic violence, it begins to distort its perception of right and wrong. And it is precisely in this terrain that the seeds of future murderers are planted. Criminal psychology studies show that the childhoods of violent criminals tend to have three central elements: isolation, trauma, and silence. And this boy, who seemed harmless, with his pencils and paper, carried all three. But what does science say about this? How can we identify the real warning signs? Could these drawings actually have prevented the crimes? Or was the criminal mind already beyond saving? What follows is not just a disturbing story. It is a stark and raw portrait of what happens when psychology is ignored and criminal behavior disguises itself as ordinary childhood behavior. Let's dive into the details of this real-life case and take an in-depth look at the psychological triggers that transformed a quiet child into one of the most cold-blooded killers of his generation. Would you have noticed the signs? Or would you have said, "It's just a phase"? Subscribe to this channel to receive more content like this and get ready to hear one of the most shocking cases in criminal psychology. His name was Lucas. He was born in 2009 in a small town in the interior of Minas Gerais, Brazil. The typical town where everyone knows each other, where tragedies come faster through rumors than through the newspapers. He was the youngest of three brothers and lived in a simple house, in a neighborhood far from the center. His mother was an overworked grocery store clerk. His father was absent. When people asked about him, the answer was always the same: too quiet but harmless. But Lucas wasn't harmless. He was just invisible. And sometimes, invisibility is the most fertile ground for the birth of a criminal mind. Since he was 5 years old, Lucas had been drawing obsessively. They weren't random drawings. He had a fixation on the human body, but not the kind you see in textbooks. Eyes were often gouged out, mouths were sewn shut, bodies with limbs swapped, heads exploding with red scribbles. His teachers even commented among themselves about the content being too graphic for his age, but no one did anything. There was no talk with the school psychologist, no notification to his parents, because for everyone it was just exaggerated creativity. And his creativity kept speaking, loudly, but no one listened. At school, Lucas was a loner. He didn't play during recess, he didn't like soccer, he preferred to observe. His classmates said he stared too much, but he didn't say much. When he did interact, it was to ask strange questions. Have you ever seen a dead cat? And if someone disappeared, would you tell anyone? Phrases that, coming from a 10-year-old child, should immediately raise red flags in any adult. who pays the slightest attention to children's psychological development. But what did they do? They laughed. They called it a phase. They said, "He's just curious." At home, the signs were even more evident. Lucas collected dead insects. He kept them in jars inside the cupboard. When his mother found out, she just yelled at him, threw everything away, and life went on. One time, the neighbor's cat appeared with its belly cut open. No one could explain what happened. Lucas was there, watching, with his hands in his pockets, just looking. He was always around, watching the consequences but never the actions, as if testing the limits of the invisible, and so the signs kept piling up. Criminal psychology is clear in outlining the first steps of sociopathic and psychopathic behavior: sadism with animals, extreme isolation, insensitivity to the pain of others, fascination with suffering. And Lucas met each of these criteria, but in an environment where the emotional health of children is secondary. The most severe symptoms are treated as tantrums. What for a forensic psychology specialist would be grounds for immediate intervention, for the school and the family was just an annoying detail. His case is frighteningly reminiscent of Maribel's. In 1968, in the United Kingdom, Mary was just 11 years old when she killed 2 children, one of them with extreme cruelty. She also came from a dysfunctional home and was described as introspective, with strange behavior and a taste for violence. Before the crimes, Mary used to act bizarrely with animals and had been seen hurting classmates. Her drawings also showed a fixation with wounds, empty eyes, ropes, knives, but no one saw anything there that required serious attention, and when they did, it was too late. The connection between Lucas and Mary goes beyond the lines on the page. They were both children who gave warnings, children who cried out for help in unconventional but clear ways, and yet they were ignored. Because signs don't always come in words. Sometimes they come in silence. They come in blank stares, in scribbles from a mind that is trying to understand the chaos it has been thrown into. Children like Lucas are not born that way. They are molded, mold after mold. They learn to distrust affection, to see violence as natural, to see pain as something banal. Child psychology explains this as affective dissociation, an extreme defense mechanism, common in children exposed to repetitive trauma without a support network. Lucas had no friends. There was no listening. I had no emotional tools. He had paper and pencil. And what started as disturbing drawings evolved. First, it was a little bird with its wings clipped, then a cat buried in the backyard. He said he found it that way. Then 3 rabbits disappeared from school. So the new boy in class disappeared. And when they started putting the pieces together, they realized that all the scenes had already been drawn weeks before. These drawings, now filed as evidence in a case that is being held in secret, are more than evidence. They are maps of the mind of a killer in the making, maps that have been ignored. And why have they been ignored? Because society still refuses to accept that evil can begin in the cradle. It is still reluctant to see that children can also carry traits of psychopathy, that unrecognized signs in childhood can cost lives. Today, Lucas's case is being analyzed by a team of forensic psychologists, criminal experts, and psychiatrists specializing in extreme juvenile behavior. The big question is no longer why, but why didn't anyone act sooner? What if someone had read those drawings correctly? What if they had looked into his eyes, not with judgment, but with active listening? Maybe, just maybe, the story would have had a different ending. But that isn't the end yet. Lucas's drawings were everywhere. In his school notebook, there was a boy with his head stitched together with red thread, as if someone had tried to silence his thoughts. On a loose sheet of paper forgotten inside his backpack, a child's body lay over what looked like a well, its eyes drawn as 2 empty black circles. On another sheet of paper, a sequence of scenes, like a storyboard from a nightmare. A child being pulled by large faceless hands, then locked in a dark room with walls that seemed to bleed. On each sheet, a shaky, irregular line, and a clear pattern for those who knew what to look for. The teachers even saw these drawings. One of them even commented in class, "Lucas, why do you draw such strange things?" He simply replied, without looking the teacher in the eye, "Because that's what I see when I close my eyes." The answer drew uncomfortable laughter from the class. The teacher smiled awkwardly and changed the subject. No report was made, no conversation with the principal, no calls to the parents. One of his classmates, Anna Clara, recalled in her testimony that Lucas had a separate notebook hidden at the bottom of his backpack. It was an old notebook with scribbles all over the cover. We thought it was a diary, but one day he showed it to a boy. It had a drawing of a child tied to a chair, with his mouth covered with tape. I saw it too. I was scared, but he said it was just a joke, that he dreamed these things. Another classmate confirmed. He said he liked to play hide-and-seek games. We thought it was just a strange way of talking, like a kid's joke, but it wasn't a joke. It was a symptom. His games were also different. He never wanted to run, jump, or play ball. He preferred to play alone, burying things in the schoolyard. Once, he was seen putting a small doll's shoe in a hole and covering it with dirt. When asked what he was doing, he replied, "It's her grave." He was 9 years old. Another time, he tried to strangle a classmate with his own backpack during a fight. He said it was just to see how his eyes would bulge out. These were isolated but frequent episodes. They were always seen as difficult behavior, never as clinical warning signs. His mother in later interviews revealed that Lucas used to say strange phrases before going to sleep. Today, no one screamed, or, "The silence is beautiful." She attributed these phrases to the fertile imagination of a lonely child. She said he was just introspective, didn't like to talk. But he was never aggressive with me, she said. Only with his brothers. And even then it was just a boy thing, a child's fight. His father, absent since he was 3 years old, barely knew that Lucas still existed. Emotional neglect. This was the first and biggest psychological trigger. A home where no one listens, no one notices, no one validates. An environment where feelings are not welcomed but ignored, where crying is seen as a whim and silence as tranquility. The lack of emotional bonds is a time bomb in emotional development, and Lucas was at the center of this countdown. Another obvious trigger was a lack of empathy. Lucas did not react to the suffering of others. When a teacher fell in class and hurt her arm, the class was frightened, and some students cried. Lucas just watched, fixedly. He did not move a muscle. Later, he commented, "The blood flowed beautifully." Reports indicate that he had a strange fascination with blood, pain, and silence. When one of his brothers fell off his bike and cried, Lucas is said to have said, "If you close your eyes, it will seem like you are already dead." These behaviors are described in criminal psychology as desensitization to the pain of others. Children exposed to recurrent trauma and who do not receive emotional support tend to develop a kind of psychic armor, where pain is no longer perceived as something negative. It becomes common, natural, part of everyday life, and over time, it begins to be reproduced, not out of malice, but because it is the only language they know. The pattern is repeated in many case studies of violent children: the progressive loss of empathy, the normalization of violence, and the replacement of affection with control. Lucas wanted control, not because he understood what power was, but because it was the only way to feel something in a world where everything seemed apathetic. His drawings were about that: control, who tied him up, who silenced him, who watched. He always drew himself, observing, never taking direct action, always in the corner, always in the dark. The people around him saw all of this, but they saw it with unprepared eyes. Without the filter of psychological knowledge, the signs were cataloged as oddities, as traits of a different but harmless boy. But forensic psychology teaches that it is precisely in this type of difference that the first outlines of criminal behavior are hidden. Because violence rarely begins with a scream, it begins with a whisper, and Lucas was whispering the whole time. Lucas's behaviors were not just disconnected episodes from a troubled childhood. They were organized fragments of a mental structure out of balance, and criminal psychology recognizes these signs with disturbing clarity. What to the layman's eye appeared to be morbid creativity or playing in bad taste is to specialists in child mental health and deviant behavior, in fact, a psychological map of the early stages of a broken mind. When a child draws mutilated bodies, invents games involving death or torture, or reacts coldly to the pain of others, he or she is, consciously or not, communicating something that he or she cannot express verbally. And this something is usually rooted in traumatic experiences that, when not validated, become serious behavioral symptoms. Forensic psychology classifies this type of manifestation as a symbolic expression of trauma. Lucas did not talk about his feelings. but left everything exposed in images. He drew as if he were narrating what he was experiencing internally, and each disturbing scene was an unconscious attempt to organize his emotional pain through visual representations. The drawings in these cases function as bridges between the child's internal and external world, and when these bridges are ignored, the child continues to try to express himself in increasingly extreme ways. Within child psychopathology, experts identify some disorders that directly relate to the behaviors displayed by Lucas. One of them is conduct disorder. This is a disorder characterized by persistent patterns of antisocial, aggressive, and defiant behavior, usually manifesting in childhood or adolescence. Children with this disorder may demonstrate cruelty to animals, constantly lie, steal, bully peers, and demonstrate a total lack of remorse. Lucas met all of these criteria. He barely blinked in the face of suffering. He showed no empathy. When punished for something, he showed no remorse, only withdrawal. He did not understand the impact of his actions because he never learned to recognize or validate his own emotions. Another trait often seen in similar cases is early sociopathy, also known as early-stage antisocial personality disorder. Although this diagnosis can only be formally given in adolescence, the signs appear much earlier. The lack of deep emotional connections, the manipulation of other people's feelings, the indifference to pain, the pleasure of exerting control over others, all of these appear as seeds during childhood. In Lucas, these seeds were germinating in fertile soil, a neglectful home, an unprepared school, a community that preferred to label rather than treat. Criminal psychology suggests that children who experience unspoken abuse, such as constant humiliation, emotional exclusion, or exposure to domestic violence, often channel this pain into the only place where they still have some control, their inner world. And it is in this world that monsters are born that later take on external form. Aggressive behavior is not the root, it is the symptom. Silence, introspection, macabre, drawings, phrases with double meanings, all of these are disguised screams. Screams that, if not heard, turn into actions. Children also cry out for help with images. This phrase, said by a forensic psychologist who followed Lucas's case, sums up the complexity of the situation. Art, in this context, is not just expression, it is diagnosis, it is evidence. And it was precisely this evidence that went unnoticed by everyone around him. The lack of an emotionally safe environment prevented Lucas from learning to name his emotions. And when a child does not learn to name what he feels, he begins to act out what he feels. Pain turns into behavior, trauma into a violent narrative. Lucas drew children in cages because he felt trapped. He drew bodies without eyes because no one could see him. He drew hands without fingers because he had never felt the touch of welcome. Everything his mind produced came from a place of chronic pain, and this pain accumulated, invisible, with each ignored drawing, each minimized sentence, each unempathetic reaction he received. Lucas reinforced the idea that his pain did not matter, and when pain does not matter, life also loses importance. Emotional desensitization, common in children subjected to prolonged abuse or emotional neglect, causes them to no longer recognize the difference between affection and aggression. For Lucas, violence was not an exception. It was routine. It was not an isolated traumatic event. It was the backdrop to his emotional development. Child psychology shows that the developing brain absorbs the environment as absolute truth. And if the environment is cold, hostile, and neglectful, the child learns that this is the model of the world he should replicate. Over time, Lucas began to transfer the content of his drawings to reality. He was no longer satisfied with symbolic representation alone. He began to test, experiment, and understand what it felt like to cause real pain. And, like all psychopathological behavior, it began subtly, pushing a colleague down the stairs, cutting off a cat's tail, crushing a bird with a rock. Small acts that, to his mind, did not mean cruelty. They meant presence. They meant, perhaps, feeling something. Criminal psychology treats these experiences as behavioral reinforcements. The more he acted and was not punished appropriately or given therapeutic support, the more he reinforced the idea that this was his only channel of communication with the world. Violent behavior, in this case, does not arise from malice. It arises from the need for validation, to be perceived, even if only as a threat, because the fear of others for Lucas became more comforting than the indifference he had always received. Lucas's case is a painful portrait of the failure of a system that still doesn't know how to deal with silent childhood pain, a system that looks for someone to blame before seeking understanding, that prefers to medicate rather than listen, that marginalizes children who need, above all, early intervention, correct diagnosis, emotional structure, and, most importantly, an adult willing to see beyond what is being said. Because when the adult doesn't listen to what the child feels, the child shows what he or she feels in the way he or she knows how. And sometimes this way is destructive, but this destruction is never instantaneous. It comes in waves, in detail, in drawings, and every line Lucas made was a line that could have been stopped if only someone had learned to read. The turning point happened on a seemingly ordinary day. It was a Monday in April. The sky was clear, the sun wasn't too strong, and the courtyard of the municipal school was full of children running, laughing and playing. But Lucas wasn't there. He had arrived earlier that day, silent as always, carrying his worn backpack and a new notebook. No one noticed when he left the group. No one saw where he went. His absence was only noticed when the teacher took attendance for the first class and noticed that another name hadn't been answered either. Vinicius, the new boy in the class, with whom Lucas rarely spoke, but who in the previous days had started to get closer to him. He was a skinny, shy, curious boy who tried what many didn't try, to talk to Lucas. Vinicius's body was found 3 hours later, behind the school gym, in an isolated area where almost no one went. The scene was grotesque for any age, but when it came to children, the shock was multiplied. Vinicius was lying down with his arms tied together by a makeshift rope. His mouth had been covered with duct tape, and there were clear signs of physical abuse. Next to the body, a spiral notebook was open to a page that looked more like a horror film than a children's drawing. And the most disturbing detail was the detail. The drawing depicted exactly what the police found there. A boy wearing the same clothes as Vinicius, in the same position, with the same setting. That was no coincidence. It was a script. The investigation began immediately. The school was in a state of panic. Teachers tried to keep the students calm while the police surrounded the place. The principal, visibly shaken, said she could never have imagined that something like this would happen there. When the experts analyzed the notebook, they noticed that this was not the only page with similar representations. There were at least 5 other drawings of similar scenes, all with children in situations of imprisonment, pain, and death. The signature in the lower right corner of each page was the same, a small letter L inside a square. Lucas had left his identity marked on each scene. It was as if he wanted to be discovered. The investigators called the management to try to identify the owner of the notebook. It only took a brief glance for the coordinator to recognize it. It belongs to Lucas. The name, until then discreet, became the epicenter of a tragedy that was about to be revealed in layers. When the police went to the room, Lucas was there sitting drawing, in silence. His backpack was at the foot of the table. When they asked if he knew where Vinicius was, he simply said, "I don't think he's coming back." That was enough to set off all the alarms, and that was when the mask fell. When they searched his backpack, they found more sheets of paper with previously unpublished drawings. One of them showed a scene that had not yet happened, a fallen teacher with an injury to her arm. Weeks later, this same teacher would suffer an accident while trying to stop a fight at school. The connection between the drawings and real events began to haunt the investigators. It was as if Lucas was planning his actions before carrying them out, as if he was testing his fantasies on paper before bringing them to reality. The community was in shock. Local newspapers ran headlines that sounded like they were taken from a horror movie. Child killer, police investigating, link between drawings and student's death. Families panicked. The school suspended classes indefinitely. Parents' groups formed to demand explanations. How did no one see it? How did no one take action? How was it possible that a boy was drawing deaths inside the school and no one did anything? Lucas's mother, when contacted, collapsed. In tears, she said that she had always known he was different, but she had never imagined he was capable of something like that. He was quiet, yes, but he was also so needy, so alone. I thought it was just shyness. I never thought that. Oh my God, I never thought. She handed the investigators a notebook that she had found at home, hidden under the boy's mattress. In it, there were more drawings. But these were different. They showed adults, figures similar to his mother, to his teachers, always in situations of suffering. They were more elaborate, darker illustrations, with phrases written in tiny letters next to them. They don't listen. Silence hurts less. If they cry, it's because they're alive. The school felt obliged to provide public clarification. At a press conference, the principal stated that Lucas never demonstrated overt aggressive behavior, and that the teachers tried to accommodate him within their means. But the truth is that the means were never enough. A psychologist from the public school system was assigned to analyze Lucas's drawings. In his preliminary report, he wrote, "There is a clear pattern of desensitization to violence, externalization of fantasies of control, and a total lack of empathy in the graphic representations. This is not a case of sudden aggression, but of prolonged and ignored psychological deterioration." Some classmates reported that days before Vinicius's death, Lucas began to get closer to the boy. He started sharing sweets, telling stories, and smiling discreetly, something he rarely did. It was as if he was preparing the groundwork. Criminal psychology explains this behavior as emotional manipulation, a common strategy among young people with psychopathic traits who use brief moments of simulated empathy to establish trust with their victims. There is no real emotional involvement, just calculation, a rehearsal for total control. After the crime, the police carried out a thorough search of Lucas's room. They found boxes with collected objects, pieces of broken toys, newspaper clippings about tragedies, dead animals preserved in alcohol, and more than 30 pages with scenes of extreme graphic violence. The content was so disturbing that some of the officers were temporarily removed after the analysis. But what caught their attention the most was a page stuck to the wall with the following sentence written in red, "Now they will look at me." This sentence became a symbol of the entire case, because there, in that dark, cramped room, was the final cry of a boy who spent years trying to be seen and only succeeded when he became what he feared most. The investigation continued, revealing that Lucas had planned the crime weeks in advance. Vinicius's drawing had been done at least 20 days before the murder, and there were other similar drawings, with other schoolmates. The police acted quickly, but the damage was already done. The community went into mourning. Teachers, neighbors, colleagues, everyone wondered where they had gone wrong, and the answer was painful. They had gone wrong in everything. They had gone wrong in not listening. They had gone wrong in not observing. They had gone wrong in not acting. Lucas tried to point it out, but no one could read it. How many other children are drawing pictures for help right now? How many are silently hiding in their rooms, creating internal worlds where pain is normalized, where love is a distant concept, where trauma becomes routine? Lucas's story is not isolated. It is a crooked mirror that reflects what many prefer not to see: neglected childhood as a matrix for criminal behavior. Criminal psychology has warned for decades that the signs are present long before the first violent act. And, almost always, these signs are ignored due to lack of preparation, fear, or simple indifference. It is uncomfortable to think that a child can carry within them the seed of violence, but it is necessary, because reality does not wait for society to be ready to see it. Lucas's notebooks, now stored as evidence in an ongoing trial, have become central pieces in studies of child criminal behavior. They are not just objects of evidence, they are psychological documents, emotional maps of a mind that begged, in tortuous lines and scenes of horror, for some kind of listening. On each page there was a scene, a story, a warning, but no adult around him was trained to interpret it. No one knew how to translate what did not come in words, and that is what makes it all the more frightening. He did not hide. Lucas never hid what he thought, what he felt, what he fantasized. He simply used the language that was available to him, the language of images, the language of silence. It is important to understand that children are not born bad. Developmental psychology is categorical in stating that antisocial traits do not arise out of nowhere. They are cultivated, nurtured, and when there is no intervention, these traits deepen, take root, and become patterns of behavior. In Lucas, it all started with emotional abandonment, the lack of connection, emotional loneliness. He had no one to share his fears, desires, frustrations with, and the lack of an emotional mirror causes the child to disconnect from his own empathy. He stops recognizing the pain in others because he has never seen his own pain being recognized. It is a slow, progressive, silent process, and brutal. In recent interviews, forensic psychologists who have followed Lucas's case have stated that if there had been any kind of appropriate intervention at the first signs, and the first signs began at age 5, perhaps the entire outcome could have been avoided. Perhaps the boy would still be alive. Perhaps Lucas would have found another way to exist. But this maybe is the most haunting, because it reveals that the potential for change existed, and it was wasted. When we talk about criminal behavior in children, we are most often talking about consequences and not conscious choices. We are talking about developing minds that have been shaped by neglect. Behavioral analysis and criminal psychology show us that children who commit serious crimes do not do so spontaneously. There is a history, there are patterns, and these patterns are almost always noticeable. The difference lies in who is willing to see, who is attentive enough to notice that a drawing is not just a scribble, but an attempt at symbolic organization of internal chaos, that a loose phrase can be a call for help, that a violent game can be a reflection of what the child experiences at home. Nothing is gratuitous. Nothing is innocent when we talk about the developing mind, and every detail matters. What Lucas's story reveals, with all its cruelty, is the collective responsibility we bear. Teachers, parents, health professionals, school administrators, they all failed. And not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to deal with it. Society still treats deviant behavior in childhood as a taboo. It still fears the idea that a child could be dangerous, but this fear paralyzes. And when it becomes paralyzed by clear signs, the next step is tragedy. That's why we need to talk about it. We need to bring the data, the studies, the reports to light. We need to prepare our schools, our families, our professionals to see what's been there all along. Because the next Lucas might already be drawing. And maybe, this time, someone will be able to see it. Would you have noticed the signs? Or would you have thought it was just a phase? Think about it honestly. How many times have you heard someone say, "He's just weird. That kid has a great imagination. That's normal"? How many times have you downplayed a behavior because it seemed too harmless to be a cause for concern? And most importantly, how many times have you ignored something because it was easier to ignore? It's painful to admit, but it's necessary. Change only happens when denial gives way to responsibility. And this responsibility is collective. It's not about blaming, it's about recognizing. To learn from mistakes, to listen more, to look more closely. Because every strange behavior can be a scream. Every non-standard sentence can be a symptom. Every lonely child may be about to get lost, or being saved. And now, after hearing this story, after knowing the details, the signs, the neglect, the pain, I need to ask you, do you know anyone who behaved like this in childhood? A classmate who drew strange scenes? Who preferred to play alone? Who spoke phrases that no one understood? A sibling? A cousin? A neighbor? Someone you thought was just different, but who now seems to have shown signs that you ignored?